Hello everyone, this is chapter 12, and in this chapter we're going to discuss the correlational research strategy. The chapter outline will be as follows. We will introduce the topic of correlational research. We will talk about data and statistical analysis for correlational data. We will talk about the applications of the correlational strategy, and we'll conclude by discussing the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. And for the chapter limerick, when patterns start taking formation, you can learn with a quick correlation their strength and direction for prediction, reflection, though it won't be enough for causation. This is section 1 of chapter 12, and the goal here will be to introduce the topic of correlational research. So the correlational research strategy is one of the 5 basic strategies that we discussed previously in this course. And the goal of this strategy is to examine and describe the associations and relationships between variables. Now, this strategy differs from others by not attempting to explain the relationships, nor does it manipulate any variables or control any variables. It does not interfere with the world, merely describes it. So with a correlational strategy, the most you can say is that there is some relationship between variables. And you can describe that relationship as well, but you can't say why it exists. You can't say that one variable is causing a change in the other. So correlational research requires collecting 2 or more measurements for each individual. And in psychology, typically we're dealing with people, but really the collection of these data points could be from a single source. It could be from a car or an airplane, not necessarily a human. Anyway, so an example of correlation would be taking a group of people and collecting information about how much coffee they drink per day and how many hours of sleep they get per night. And maybe you find that people that drink more coffee sleep fewer hours. That would be a typical use of the correlational strategy. And again, in that case, you have discovered and described a relationship without explaining why it exists. All right, so before we proceed and discuss the gory details of correlational research, let's take a moment and compare it to strategies that we've discussed thus far. So for example, experimental research. The goal there is to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between 2 variables. And this involves manipulation, measurement, control, and comparison. So you manipulate the independent variable to create different conditions. You control extraneous variables that may become confounds. You collect measurements between your conditions. And you compare the measurements to look for significant differences between the groups. By contrast, the goal of correlational research is to simply demonstrate the existence of a relationship between variables. And again, you do so by measuring 2 variables for a single individual without manipulation or control, just passive measurement. And again, you focus on patterns within these pairs of scores to determine the relationship without attempting to explain that relationship in terms of causality. And We also have differential research. And recall that the goal here is to establish the existence of a relationship also, but this time by demonstrating a difference between groups. So this approach is similar to correlational research, but focuses on group differences rather than individual pairs of scores. For example, imagine a study that divides students into high and low self-esteem groups and then measures academic performance to see if there's a difference between these groups. That would be an example of differential research. So if you need to, please pause the video here, and I've created a table that summarizes the differences between these strategies and provides examples of each. All right, that concludes the introduction to correlational research. And in the next section, we're going to discuss the statistical analysis for correlational studies. See you then.